it is time now to do our jingle bells. And these bells use a couple of different techniques. We're going to fill the main part, the upper and lower parts of the bell, with brick stitch. And then we're going to do some satin stitching across the rim, but this time we are going to pad this satin stitch, but with a slightly different technique. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. The first thing we're going to work on is the brick stitch in the upper and lower halves. So let me talk to you a little bit about the brick stitch. The brick stitch is a really easy and very versatile way to fill a space. And at its most basic, it's really just a back stitch or rows of back stitch where the point where the stitches start and end, alternate on each row. Let me show you what I mean by that. If you think of like a row of bricks, how, the intersections, on one row are here and here, and on the next row, the intersection is in between that brick. That's what it's going to look like. So let me just show you briefly. I have a shape here, a simple shape, and I'm going to do a basic back stitch, making sure that I go in right where the previous stitch ended. So that's my first row. Now the next row, I am going to pay attention to where the center of this stitch is, of each stitch. So on this row, I had 3 complete stitches. Now I'm going to start out with a half stitch. So it's going to be a pretty short stitch. But now I can come to the halfway mark of that second stitch on the first row, and now I'm just going to do back stitches again. Go to the halfway point on that stitch next to it and do a back stitch. Now I have to do another half stitch. Now for this next row, I can do 3 full stitches. So I'm going to come up at the halfway mark of that stitch next to it and do a full stitch. The halfway mark on the stitch next to that one, and then one more full stitch. And then this row will be just like the second row. A half stitch, and then a full stitch that goes from the halfway point to the halfway point of the stitch above it. And then a little half stitch down here. Alright, so that's just the basic brick stitch. Really simple. But, that's in a square, in a rectangle shape, straight lines. We're going to be working on our bell, which is curved shapes, but it works just the exact same way. So let me go over to the bell now, and I'll show you on there. And here is our bell. You can see that I've already stitched the black sections for the holes in the bottom section of the bell, and you do want to do that first. And I did a sort of bizarre, crazy brick stitch in there. It doesn't really matter what stitch you use to fill that up. You could use satin stitch or whatever. I just did a whole bunch of random back stitches just to get those shapes filled. Doesn't really matter. You can't see the stitches anyway since they're black, and they're going to be partially, the edges are going to be covered up when we do all the stitching later. So just doesn't really matter how you fill those up. Just get those done first. Okay, so now we're going to start on the actual brick stitch on the top and bottom half. And it does not matter which section you do. These sections aren't blended in any way. One is not on top of the other. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of like a coloring book. Think of it that way. It doesn't matter if you fill in, this shape first and this one second and this one third. It doesn't really matter. I still tend to sort of think left to right a little bit. which in this case happens to be dark, sort of over to light, but that doesn't really matter. Like I said, if you want to start on this shape and work out, doesn't matter. But I am going to start on, not at the very, very left, but I'm going to start in this shape right here with this sort of dark brown. Now, as simple as the brick stitch is, there are just a couple of things to keep in mind. Two things. The length of your stitches, and the direction. So in the sample I did, I was just doing straight lines in a rectangle. But because this is a curved shape, I'm going to think a little bit about what direction I want my stitches to go. It doesn't really matter because in the end, it's just going to be a block of color that's filled in that when you look at it from a distance, it's going to look three-dimensional because of how we have used the dark, the medium, and the light, and then the really light colors. So anyway, I just decided, okay, for like these outside sections, I'm going to work, around the curve of the bell. So since I want to start in this little, I don't know what kind of shape that little pointy curved section, I am going to start there. Now, the other issue is the length of your stitches. Now, remember when I talked about when we were doing the split back stitch on the outline of the leaf, and I said, my rule is always the tighter the curve, the shorter the stitch. That, doesn't necessarily apply here because you don't want to make your back stitches when you're doing brick stitch super tiny, and that was the mistake I made on the first bell that I did. This is the third one I'm stitching, and I've figured it out by this point. So I sometimes tend to have really, really short stitches, and I started doing that because this is this little curve right here, and I realized my stitches were just so short. It was getting, and as the more I stitched, it was getting harder and harder and harder to find the halfway point and then make a half stitch out of a little, next to a teeny tiny stitch, and then that stitch got tiny, and everything was just so cramped and tiny. It just was not, A, it wasn't fun to do, and B, it just kind of looked, I don't know, it didn't have a good, nice, discernible texture to it. It was just like cramped stitches. So I know everything is relative, but for me, I have to remind myself to keep my stitches a little bit longer. So you can see in there, I did 4 stitches. So now I'm up at the top. So now I'm going to, just like I did before, find the halfway point of that second stitch and go up, and the halfway point of that stitch, halfway point of that stitch, and then a little tiny half stitch. So now you can see right here, this is already a little teeny tiny half stitch. If I had made that first stitch, 2/3 that length, this tiny stitch would be you almost couldn't even see it. So maybe you tend to stitch with longer stitches, and this is not going to be an issue for you. But I just know for myself, when I'm stitching curves, I tend to go a little shorter, and that was not the way to go about this. So, and the first bell you do, or the first section of bell that you do, or, you might figure out what your tendencies are, and you may have to lengthen or shorten. So, but as you stitch, you'll kind of find your rhythm, and you'll start to see that texture, that kind of brick-like texture show up. So there's the first section done. Let me go get the second color on my needle. I've done a little bit of stitching now with the second color, and you can see that I'm still going in a curved shape around the shape of this bell. And there's another thing I want you to keep in mind while you're working on your brick stitch. When you want the lines that sit next to each other to be very close together. You don't want to have the color of the fabric underneath showing through. But you do need to be careful. I'm working right up here now. When you do want that stitch to be really close. Can you see that needle coming up right there? But you do want to be very careful that you don't split. Can you see how that needle has split that stitch that's next to it? I don't want that. I want to take the time to make sure that while my stitch that I'm putting next to this row is very close to it, I don't want to split the stitches that are next to it, because what gives brick stitch its very pretty and very unique texture is that it's these very distinct, basically a bar of color. Each stitch is like a bar. And if I split that stitch, it's not going to have that distinct, each stitch is not going to have that distinct shape. So it takes just a second to make sure that you are not coming up inside and splitting the stitch next to it when you are working rows next to each other. Here's the top half of the bell stitched, and as far as direction of stitches, obviously for these stitches along the rim I went this direction, and then even though these I was going around, for this middle area I went back and forth this way, still sort of following the curve. And then for the lightest area, this little curved triangle thing, I went back to kind of going like this. But the direction is not going to be critical if you did yours, like if you did this center section going up and down instead of across. It's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. And this is one of those I've found, I don't know what it is about it, this is one of those techniques when you're filling in these blocks of colors and with all of these little back stitches, you're going to get about a third of the way in or halfway through, and you're going to be thinking to yourself, this is a mess. This is not going to look like anything. I don't like this, because that's how I felt on every single one of these. Every single section I did, I thought to myself, this is just a mess. This is not looking like anything. But once you get all the colors stitched, and particularly once you get the whole bell stitched, if you step back from it and you're like, oh yeah, I see that. I see that the dark over here looks like it's a shadow, and now the bell looks like it's curved. Looks like it has some dimension because of the highlighted area. Trust me. Just keep stitching, fill in, and when you get finished, you'll step back from it and think, yeah, that actually looks pretty good. I don't know what I was thinking about in the middle when I didn't like it. So anyway, just keep stitching, right? So the next thing we're going to work on, well, you can go ahead and stitch the bottom half of the bell too. Same thing, just figure out, I followed the curve of the bell for these bottom areas, and then when I did here, I went across this way, and then for this highlighted area, which is kind of behind this, next visually, it's behind this black area. Just go back and forth, straight up and down. Doesn't matter, whatever. It'll look good. But next up, let me show you how to do this little loop at the top. For this loop, it's a little tiny curve. We're going to give it just a little bit of shading with 2 different colors of thread. And you could use a brick stitch for this, but it's just this little itty bitty curve and those stitches would be so tiny. I decided to go with a stem stitch instead. And for this one, for this little area, we're going to use 2 strands of thread. I think I forgot to mention that we were using 3 strands for everything else so far, 3 strands for the top of the bell too. But for this one, we're going to use 2 strands because it's just such a tiny area. And the stem stitch is, you're hardly going to be able to see it up here because it's so tiny, but the stem stitch is good for curves. And come up, and you're going to want to hold that thread, and this is an area where tiny curve equals tiny stitches, okay? Hold that loop open, come up inside, come in between where you came up and down. Pull that thread, and now do the same thing. Hold this thread to the bottom, go over a little tiny space, hold that loop open, come up in between. All right, and then, I mean, this is like so few stitches. It's like maybe 3, 4 stitches. So tiny. Yeah, and then just go down. So we're just going to do one row of that darkest brown, and then we're going to do 2 rows of this golden yellow, the next, the next lightest shade of the 4 shades. Before we can do the rim of the bell, we have to do one more thing, and that is to outline the top and the bottom with couching. And I love couching because it's real simple, first of all, and it is a good way to get a nice smooth line. And that's why I chose to do it here, because while I love the brick stitch, it does not necessarily leave a really smooth line. And I wanted a very, and it gives a little bit of dimension as well. So I wanted a nice smooth line to go around the edge of this bell. So to couch, we are going to be using 6 strands, and that will be our surface thread. In other words, that's the thread that will stay on the surface. And then we are using 1 strand, which will be the thread that we use to attach this surface thread onto the fabric. Now, a note, this is one of the few times that how I always preach how to, stripping your threads before you use them. This is a time that I do not strip my threads. Since I'm using all 6 strands, I want it to maintain this kind of, rope-like round texture. I don't want it to be flat like a ribbon. I want it to have a little bit of roundness to it when it lays on the fabric. So I do not strip it. I use the 6 strands just like they come off of the skein. Okay, so to couch. I've already done the top part. So you just come up with you put the 6 strands on one needle, and you come up, and then we're not going to need that needle for a while. So if you only have one needle, you can just take that thread off of this needle and put it aside for a minute. I have 2 needles, so I'm going to just leave it on the needle, but just put that needle aside for a moment. So now I'm going to come up. I have my 1 strand on my other needle. So now I will come up on the line and just simply put a very simple stitch from one side to the other on to the surface thread to hold it in place. So when I'm couching, it's really helpful to have a hoop stand, or just figure out some way so you can use both hands, because I use one hand to direct the thread as I'm moving around, and the other hand to sew, to stitch it on with this needle. So this hand is just sort of keeping a little bit of tension on this. How close together you put these stitches kind of goes back again to that, small curves. If you've got a really tight curve, I put these couching threads, the 1 strand, closer together. If I'm doing a long straight line, you can put them a little bit further apart. Like we're going to be couching the letters later, so like this long line right here doesn't need to be connected, doesn't need to be sewn onto the fabric every 1/8 of an inch. You can go a little further apart. But here, and it doesn't matter if you go from outside to inside or inside, to outside. Now the other thing you want to do, we are going to follow this design around here, make a tight turn right there, go up the side of this black part, around there, down, up, around, down, and then make another tight turn and come up. So I really want to outline the shape of that opening. This will also make it look like the black part is inside, since it's really a shadow is what it is. It's inside the gold part. So when I come to a point that needs a turn, like a corner where this thread is going to turn, I always make sure I put a stitch right there. So I'm going to come up right at that point with my one strand, and I'm going to go down, and with my hand on the back I'm really going to hold that one strand really tight so that I can pull this up. I'm really pulling on that one little stitch, the one strand thread, so that I can make that sharp turn. If I let go, it's going to do that. Do you see how it came loose from the fabric like that? I'm going to make sure that little stitch stays really tight while I am trying to make this sharp corner. So now you kind of have to work it so that you continue to try to hold that one stitch tight while also coming up pretty close to where that really tight corner is. So now I'm going to make sure I pull this one pretty tight, make that tight point, and go down. So you just don't want that point to get loose so that it loses its definition. So everywhere you have a place where this surface thread needs to change direction, like now I've been going straight and now I want to go around. So I'm going to make sure, I think I just kind of had one, but I'll put one more little stitch right at that point where the circle starts on the black part. And now, because this is a little teeny circle, I'm going to make my the stitches that hold down the 6 strands, I'm going to make them really close together so I get a nice defined little circle right there. Maybe you can see I'm switching from going from inside to outside and outside to inside. Like I said, that just doesn't matter. Go all the way around that little circle. So now this is another spot where it's a point where the 6 strands of thread changes direction. Those strands lined up. So I'm going to make sure I have a stitch right at that point, like that. Now I can come down that curve. And here's a point right at this center, the center of the bell right here. I want to make sure I have a stitch right there because it's, it defines that very bottom point. Like that. And now it's going to come back up this way. And I'll do the same thing around this black area. Okay, so I will finish that, and we'll talk about how to finish your line of couching. All right, to finish, I'm going to go back, and I've already taken my one strand back down to the back, and then now I have my needle that has my 6 strands on it, and all you got to do is just go down at the end of whatever line it is that you're couching, pull that through, and then knot those threads, the 6 strands and the one strand, knot them on the back, and you are finished with your couching. Now for the last part of the bell we're going to work on is the rim. And to do the rim, I didn't want to just do more brick stitch because it would, the rim is supposed to be raised. It's like a raised band around a bell. And so I wanted it to be raised up and have a little bit of a different texture. So to do that, I decided to pad some satin stitching. And there's a lot of different ways to pad satin stitching. You can use other stitches. But what we are going to do is to use a piece of wool felt. So here's the pattern for the rim. and it is printed onto sticky label paper. So what I'm going to do is peel this sticky pattern and put it onto my felt. But important, before I stick it onto my felt, I need to reduce the stickiness of this. It's really sticky and I don't want to just pull all this felt and make it super fuzzy. So I am going to I have a scrap piece of felt that I use. You can use your t-shirt, your jeans, a towel, but another piece of felt works really well. So like here's a scrap, and I am going to just repeatedly stick that on there and carefully peel it up. And stick it on there and peel it up. And in fact, I do it like really fast. I do it a lot. And I make sure that that sticky pattern has a lot of lint on it. Can you see all that lint on the back of it? That's why you can do it on your jeans, fabric, but just do it a whole lot until it's really has reduced the stickiness. And I use, well, here, let me go ahead and stick it on. All right, so here's my scrap piece of felt. And when I've cut out the pattern, I made sure to leave some white space around the pattern line. And now I am going to use a pair of, these are 5-inch micro tip detail scissors. And I use these on all of my felt ornaments. Let me zoom out a little bit. It's a little bit easier to see that. All right, there's the scissors. Like all of my felt ornaments that I make, all of these pieces are cut out. I use these 5-inch micro tip scissors because they're super precise, really easy to use. They have a very, see this point on them, it's really detailed. So I can snip and just get right into those little detailed areas. So obviously this is not a super detailed design, but it's still nice to have nice, sharp, accurate scissors. So I'm going to cut that out right on the line. Just like that, all the way around. More little snip around that corner or that curve, and there you have it. So now there is my little felt piece, and I'm going to very carefully peel that sticky pattern off, and you can see that even though I spent all that time reducing the lint on the back of that, I still fuzzed this up a little bit. So what I will also do now, really carefully, you don't want to change the shape of your pattern, but now real carefully just kind of trim off some of those fuzzies. And because this shape is symmetrical, I can flip it over and I can use the good side, the side that didn't have the sticky pattern on it. If this was a shape that was, you know, I don't know, that wasn't symmetrical, you can't, it would be backwards. So I trim those. But since it is symmetrical, I can use the good side, but I also trim off a little bit of fuzzy. So that's how to cut out a felt pattern for the rim of our bell. So now I need to attach this felt shape in place, and I want to hold it in place so that it doesn't move around while I'm satin stitching over it. So I'm just taking one strand of, honestly, it doesn't really matter what color, and you could use more than one strand. I mean, don't use like 6 strands, but you're just going to put some really tiny little stitches that are just going to hold it in place, because these stitches are going to be covered up anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But I'm just going to put a couple of teeny tiny stitches just like that, just so it doesn't shift around while I am doing my satin stitching. So to stitch over this felt, I am using 3 strands. And again, now these strands I have stripped because I do want them to lay nice and flat and be shiny. So I'm going to use my first color, and I'm just going to here on this sort of curved edge, we're going to put some couching around this later, but just kind of, and all of this satin stitching is going to be vertical like this, across this way. And just follow the color chart and just come up on one side of the felt and go down on the other. Same thing though, if you want, you might need to get those stitches. And don't pull these stitches too tight, because you don't want to just completely squish the felt so that it, it's like it wasn't even there. You want these stitches to be, raised up, almost like a little pillow. Oh boy, those are wanting to twist, aren't they? Oh, it got really twisty. But anyway, just go across the felt. Don't pull them too tight so that the whole rim of the bell has a slightly raised appearance, 3D appearance to it. To finish up the rim on the bell, we just need to do one more thing, and that is to couch a line across the top and then around onto the bottom. And we're going to use two different colors for that, just to give it a little bit more of an illusion of light and shadow, so a little bit more three-dimension. And so here I am using the lightest yellow, same as before, 6 strands couched with 1 strand. And this is really simple, of course, much simpler than having to work around those black holes, right? And so when you come to when you do switch the colors, just start right in the center over here, go around, stop in the center, and then with the darker color of kind of, golden or golden yellow, go around and do the bottom edge of the rim. And then there you go. It'll be done.